Okay, now you can hear me and see my slideshow, I hope.
Yes.
Good. All right. So in listening to the previous discussion, I realized that, in fact, what I'm talking about is a rite of passage. Maybe my own rite of passage, but it was, it reminded me, what I'm about to show you reminded me, and what was being said reminded me of a science fiction story that I've been meaning to write. And so let me tell you that science fiction story in brief for a moment. The protagonist is a mathematician, and he's complaining in the story. He's saying, well, they all stole my results. Euler, back in the 1700s, he stole all my good results. He found all those formulas. He found the results about the zeta function. He found all that. They were mine. The works on partitions, I had discovered them, and he took them. And Newton took my results, and all those mathematicians from the 1800s, they stole my results, and I'm left with just a few things. And you might wonder, how did that happen? Because they existed long before me. And of course, it was by time travel. They came forward and they took my results and took them back to their time and published them. It's obvious. And I know what they did. But the curious thing that I'm trying to figure out now is why it stopped. It stopped, you see. After 1910, it stopped. No one stole any of my results after 1910. And I finally understood. I understood that it was due to Russell's paradox. After Russell's paradox, the space-time infundibulum went through a singularity, and it was no longer possible for the time travel to go forward any further. And it's a relief for me, but a very strange business, because who knows why that happened. And that's the way my story goes. And I haven't really written it yet, but one of these days I write this story. Now, in fact, Russell's paradox and the Principia Mathematica of Russell and Whitehead was a rite of passage. And it did do something like stopping the time travel, because prior to that, there was this flowering of the possibilities of logic in the hands of Venn and Peirce and Frege, and many people working out diagrammatic and other kinds of languages that would, and cross currents that would express how logical thinking is related to everything else, beginning with how it might be related to mathematics and geometry. And then the paradox caused a shrinking and a kind of terror. And the result after Whitehead and Russell was that all logicians were expressing themselves strictly in carefully couched typographical systems and not working in that flowering way anymore at all. So it was a kind of rite of passage, but that isn't the end of the rite of passage. But many aspects of science have stopped right there, because what happened a little later, and it was a little later, it was in the early 1930s that Gödel came along and showed that the limitations of what had happened, and showed that even when you try as hard as you can to create a system which would be distinct from its meta levels, so that it would be pure and impervious to paradox, why the meta level would creep in anyway by a kind of a coding. And the meta level would cause the system either to be inconsistent, or if consistent, it would cause it to be incomplete. And that actually is almost the complete rite of passage, except that after going through the desert and coming back that way, there needs to be a realization. And the realization, of course, is slow to come. And maybe we're beginning to understand that it meant that we have to come back to the original place of flowering and not worry so much about whether systems are going to be consistent or incomplete. and understand that we're going to build many, many systems every time, because no system is going to be telling the whole story. So that's the rite of passage that I think I'm talking about here.
Hmm.
And I didn't think of it that way until 5 minutes ago.
That's nice.
So that's my first slide. Second, the next two slides are a summary, and everything I say after this is probably just a repeat of what I just said in some way. These next two slides say it, and then the further slides say it diagrammatically. We live in language that is identical to its own meta-language. Everyone knows this. It is the basic cybernetic insight that marks the ability of the speaker of any human language to know that he or she can, in that language, comment on what is said in that language. It is the basic cybernetic turn that allows communication and freedom of thought. This stance of freedom of language means that the speaker is responsible for all distinctions that she makes. And it means that you probably ought to think about what it means to make a distinction and realize that at every point of making a distinction, what happened was that cleft of language and meta-language is opened up for a moment, and then it's also closing, it's also joined. This stance of freedom of language means that it is possible to formulate paradoxical structures, such as the book that lists all the books in the library that do not list themselves, which is Russell's paradox after all. It means that it's possible to formulate paradoxical structures, and that's all right. From this point of view, you're going to be formulating structures, some paradoxical, some not. Perhaps you want to avoid certain kinds of returns, which is what a paradox is after all. When you get to a paradox, you found yourself saying, A returns to some version of A that you don't want. A returns to not A. And then you are asking to have that pathway blocked somehow. Uh, and maybe you do it by understanding the levels, and maybe you do it by some other method, but you're free. You're free to go ahead and make constructions, find out what's there to construct, and if you wish to avoid certain things, why you do that. Part of the rite of passage has partly been accomplished by many computer scientists, for example, who have to deal with exactly this. They aren't trying to create an overarching system that will avoid all paradoxes, but you'd better sure not allow me to take the box containing the operating system and put it back into itself on the surface of the computer, and so on. You simply put up blocks for the ones you don't want and keep on going, making what you need to make. This stance of freedom of meta language is what makes it possible to create formal languages that possibly are logically consistent. By Gödel, we know that even if one does create a formal language that is logically consistent, it will admit a twist of meta-language embedding within it that makes it incomplete. Thus, we're always thrown back to the basic cybernetic turn of language that is our birthright. This means that the cybernetic discussion is truly inherent in any honest disciplinary study. The participant and her world are intertwined.
Mm.
So I have a kind of abstract set of tools here, but they're also very simple, or at least I thought they were simple enough to think of teaching this way, but I'm not sure. We'll have to experiment, because one can begin by saying, well, let's play with language and notice how we can use language on language. And then you can think of lots of things to do, and they will exfoliate into activities as well. But it isn't as simple as it seems, and I'm going to play with it a little bit. These principles become the tools, and I'm going to focus on the principles. So look, here's Heinz's uh, statement. I am the observed relationship between myself and observing myself. And if you decided to diagram it like you diagram a sentence, and if I used a Spencer Brown mark, but not his syntax, to indicate observing, then I've written it below. I equals the observing of the link between is placed next to the observing of an eye next to an observed eye. That's simple enough. But the meaning went out, unless you were conversant with the language I just created. The meaning went out, and then maybe you started to do something else with it, like doodle with it or insert it into itself, or any of the games one plays with syntactical structures. So did the meaning change when I went from the top of the page to the bottom? What happens here? This is part of why this is beginning to become more complicated than you might think, but also playful, I hope. And then back to the theme, a key to understanding observing systems is to take to heart the recursive nature of language. You, the observer, are coalesced with the mark that you observe. And if we went back thinking that way, then you can't look at the formula on the bottom so impersonally. The cross piece represents you, and you're back in. But notice that when you said it in ordinary language, you never were out. There was no break between yourself and some symbol. So that there's some kind of peculiar things that go on here when we make these things. And I know well from writing a little bit more mathematically than some other people, that if I wrote the thing on the bottom, people will say to me, well, I don't know what you're doing. And if I wrote the thing on the top, or Heinz says the thing on the top, they understand perfectly well. So this problem of understanding in that way needs to be understood. The key circularity that constitutes cybernetics is that language can be equal to or encompass its own meta-language. And this slide is more or less saying what I said before, so let's move forward. I said this before, but I want to say it again. Reflexive language creates worlds. One of the potentialities of cybernetics is there's a long history of working with essential circularity of processes and indeed circular reasoning to understand nature of recursive situations. We're just beginning to understand this. Within reflexive context, we can rebuild and extend science to include the world as conversation, a conversation that constructs itself and a world. And actions and objects are identical in the reflexive domain. And I did this before as well, but I want to go through it again and show you something. So here I'm playing at a symbolic level, and I played with a self-reflexive observer, but I'm playing with some other symbolism here as well, like saying that language is the same as meta-language could be symbolized by a little equation like that. And maybe that isn't too offensive. Language is equal to its own self-commenting, but the topological line is also perhaps interesting to play with. A and a B, and then the A to the B, the A reflecting B, is on the other side of that line, like that. And then you could go around a loop, and the language would bump into itself and turn into the meta language or the commenting on the language, and it would come back and return to the language itself, and it would be all one loop. And then those models are fun to play with, the topological ones. The algebraic ones, like I said before, require a little more attention because things are broken apart in order to be put back together. So I made this king think about reflexivity and made him into the entity that thinks about the reflexivity of X, that's the G. And then the G who thinks about himself becomes the king thinking about that one. And so the G thinking about himself becomes Alice, who is the dream of the Red King. We did that before. That's very confusing. I understand that, because it goes just a couple of steps beyond the kind of reflection that we're willing to keep conscious. And it's a good thing, because if we kept all the reflectivity that goes on conscious, I think we would be overridden. There's the Red King again. And here are the Eigenforms that I'm talking about from that point of view. And even Heinz's eye is an eigenform in that formal sense, if you look at it the way we were looking at it a moment ago. It's not just that the paradoxical or the fantastic can appear as eigenforms. The objects of our common experience are imaginary in that sense. They're eigenforms for our eigenbehavior. And our mandate is to take up our language in its reflexivity and build the world anew. And now comes this little investigation of mine. Here's the king again, the construction of Alice. But I've kept one more thing in place. I said to myself, there might be more than one king who would dream of Alice. So let's make the dependence on the king explicit. G upper king, G reflects on the king, and that entity reflects on X as the king reflecting on reflection. And then you could change the role of the king if you wanted to, and you could go through the same construction, and then you would have the king, the Alice for this king is the dream of that king. And then we're free to let the king be anybody, and we could even let it be Alice. And if we let the king be Alice, then we have that Alice is reflecting is the dream of Alice, is Alice reflecting on her reflection. And we got this one at a level of thought that's almost normal. That you see the entity of Alice reflecting stops and comes back to itself. You know, once you let Alice reflect on that, it comes back to itself. That's what we created in that dreaming. And that dream and things like that are possible, even though L equals L to the L are harder to think about. But this one is topological. That's what I wanted to show you. You see, you start with A and you come around and you get A to the A reflecting on A. And then you let A feed back this way and reflect on A to the A, and it comes around and turns into A reflecting on A to the A, and they have become equal to one another, so that this equation is this particular topological picture. And now if we look in the domain of the topology, we find it unwinds. That is, and now please forget everything I said before, and maybe it's on the next slide, because I'm talking about this little topological wiggle. I start with nothing, and I let it turn on itself a little bit, and then slide under itself, and then it slides under itself again and comes back out. And the positive and negative loops have occurred from nothing. They cancel each other out. This is the emergence of the discrete, the plus and the minus from the nothing. And that turns out to be essentially the same as the equation language reflecting on language is left alone if you let language reflect on that. That's topological. Why do I think that's interesting? Because these are levels of reflection that we actually handle. If you think about it, you'll see you actually do handle this kind of level of reflection. It fits with your cognition. But if you try to get at the essence of how language and meta-language are interrelated to one another, you find yourself either thinking, well, that's obvious, or finding that it starts to become very complicated, and you build systems, and you build many systems. Some parts, because of the way the topological syntax of our minds work, is simple and works for us. And other parts always present a problem. And so what started looking simple becomes more complicated. And indeed, it does become more complicated and simple at the same time. And it is not enough to assert that language is equal to its meta-language. How does this come about? What stabilizes our ability to speak, to reflect, to think, to be observers of the systems that we are? One way to investigate it is via recursive topological language. Perhaps this is something like Leibniz's dream, but however it is done, we must converse. And so I'm only showing you some of my versions of conversation about this that are a bit symbolical, but it comes out of conversation and it goes back into conversation, however we do it. Wittgenstein's Limit and The Fellow in the Museum. I'll stop there.